So one of the other experiments that you're going to be doing here in Lab 5 is to look at the concentration of the enzyme. How does that affect the rate of our products? So you're going to be testing this in 20 seconds with 3 different concentrations of enzymes. So I've set that up here. You have the catalase 1 ml of it in a test tube 1. You have 2 mils of it in test tube 2, and then 3 in test tube 3. So you can see that. There's a different amount of hydrogen peroxide. So what we're going to do is there's different amounts of catalase. What we are going to do is add the same amount of hydrogen peroxide here and see which one works the fastest. So we are going to take our hydrogen peroxide and slowly add in about the same amount. So again, you can see that they're all starting to work, right? That all of the test tubes are producing oxygen because that's the job of catalase. But what you can see as you let this sit, so you would be measuring it with your trusty dusty ruler after 20 seconds to see which one produced the most. Again, in 20 seconds. So we're looking at a timed reaction. So from even this, right, we've been going for almost 20 seconds. Test tube 1 is producing a pretty consistent good amount with 1 of the milliliters of catalase. Test tube 2 is producing more, right? And test tube 3 is probably going to overflow while I'm talking about it because in test tube 3 you had more enzyme. So enzyme is what determines the speed of the reaction, right? So the more enzyme you have, the faster the reaction can happen. Now, note that all 3 of these test tubes had the same amount of hydrogen peroxide in it, right? They were all measured out about the same. And it's totally going to overflow. I'm just going to keep going up to see how far it goes. Over time, if I were to let this sit for, say, an hour, eventually all the test tubes would produce the same amount of bubbles of the oxygen product because enzymes are reusable. So even though test tube 1 only has 1 milliliter of enzyme in it, it's still able to go over and over again, which means eventually test tube 1 would have the ability to make just as many oxygen bubbles as test tube 3. Difference is, test tube 3 is just able to do it faster. So enzymes determine the speed of the reaction. The more enzyme, the faster the reaction. But enzymes do not determine the product that can be produced. That is determined entirely by the substrate. So remember our substrate here, right, hydrogen peroxide, is going to determine how many bubbles, how many oxygen bubbles can actually be made. So again, it's super clear that in test tube 3, you have more product in this short amount of time. But you can also see just from the time that we've been looking at this, test tube 2 is catching up, right? Test tube 2 is catching up and it will eventually meet test tube 3. And test tube 1 is also going to eventually catch up. Now, I do not have enough time in my day to film this all day so that you can see that, but it will eventually. So again, enzymes determine the speed of the reaction, but the substrate determines how much product can actually be made. It just might take a while for all of that substrate to be turned into a product. In this case, it just might take some time for test tube 1 to take all of that hydrogen peroxide and turn it into that many bubbles, but it will eventually be able to do that.